The first thing I heard was the lawyer clearing his throat. That sound hit like a punch. He slid the paper across the table and said my mother had changed her will 3 months before she died. He said the new will left everything to the woman who replaced me. I stared at the signature. My mother's name, my mother's scrawl. Not mine. Not my son's names. Not the house I had moved into. Not the savings I emptied to pay for care for 2 years. The lawyer said the woman had power of attorney now. He said there had been witnesses. He said there was nothing urgent to do unless I wanted to contest. I wanted to smash the table. We had been close. I left my job to be her full-time caregiver when her memory started getting patchy. I cooked, I bathed her, I slept in the spare room and slept badly. Friends told me I didn't have to give up my life. I told them I wanted to. The bills added up. My kids lived with their dad. I told myself being a good daughter was worth the cost. The first crack came the night she met her new friend at the adult day center. I was folding towels when she closed the door and laughed in a way she hadn't in months. 2 weeks later, the woman started coming to the house. She brought muffins. She stayed longer each visit. At first I was grateful. I welcomed any relief. Relief became routine. Routine turned into replacement. I noticed little changes. The woman started dictating who could visit. My mother's phone had a second contact named Love, not Daughter. I found a text from the woman on my mother's phone suggesting a new doctor. I asked my mother about it. She smiled and said the woman looked after her now. My mother had always said no one would take care of her like her daughter. That line disappeared. I asked my brother to come look. He lived 2 states away and had always said he'd help if things got bad. He came for a weekend and saw the woman with my mother and said it was fine, that people needed friends. He kissed my forehead and said I was doing fine. I felt a tiny burst of relief. He left promising to help with the legal stuff if needed. Then everything broke. My mother's condition worsened on a Sunday. I called the woman and asked for help. She said she was with her partner. She said she would come by later. She showed up an hour after my mother had a seizure. I watched her instruct the EMTs like she was in charge. She signed forms I never read. She told them my brother was the emergency contact because he lived farther away and could make decisions. He wasn't. He didn't know about that. Later, I found the power of attorney form in a folder in the bedroom. My name had been crossed out in pen and replaced with the woman's. I confronted her in the hallway. She said this was better for my mother. She said she loved my mother the way I couldn't anymore. She called me tired and selfish. She said everything she did was out of love. I remember wanting to scream so loud the windows would crack. At the funeral, the woman stood up and said a few words. She didn't call herself a replacement, but she described herself as the one who had sat up nights, the one who moved in, the one who eased my mother's last days. People leaned forward and nodded. Some hugged her. They looked at me with something like pity that stung, because it felt like blame. I posted a photo of my mother and me on my social media a week after the funeral. I wrote a short caption about caregiving and grief and exhaustion. A friend texted immediately and said she had heard the woman was rewriting the will. The texts started coming in from neighbors and old school friends. Some told me to let go. One said maybe my mother had wanted this. Another said I should contest the will. I hired a lawyer. I wanted to do the thing people do in movies, spend months digging up proof of undue influence and coercion. We subpoenaed medical records. We got phone logs. We found emails where the woman pressured my mother to change doctors, to change beneficiaries, to move a bank account. One email caught in my throat. It started polite and then read like a script of commands. Don't let your daughter interfere. Do this now. Change the signature. The dates clustered around the dementia progression. My lawyer said this could be undue influence. I felt a false victory when we filed the first motion. Overnight, my inbox filled with messages of support. My brother texted that he was proud. I sat up late rereading emails and imagining the court finding the will invalid and everything coming back to me. I allowed myself to picture paying off debts, fixing the roof, being the daughter my mother thought I was. Then the pressure tightened. The woman's lawyer produced a recorded conversation where my mother said she wanted to change the will. The recording was shaky, but the word love was clear. The judge allowed the will to stand through temporary measures. The bank had already released a small emergency sum to the woman to cover funeral expenses. She posted a photo of the flowers on social media and thanked everyone who had supported her. Comments poured in. The narrative flipped on its head online. The woman was caring. The daughter was grasping. My brother stopped answering my calls after that post. I left a voicemail and he answered once and said he needed time. Then he sent a short text saying family matters were complicated and he couldn't get involved. I watched my ally vanish through a tiny screen. I'd painted him as someone who would show up. He didn't. My lowest point came in a tiny kitchen at 2 a.m. I was going through the last box of my mother's letters, looking for any shred of intent that contradicted the will. I found a birthday card she'd written to me when I was 17. Her handwriting was the same as on the will. That was the symbolic death. Her handwriting, once a map of home, now the proof of my loss. I felt like the daughter in every other person's story. Expendable, forgiven, moved on. I saw a therapist because the lawyer kept saying this would get ugly and I would need to be steady. The therapist asked me who I was without caregiving. I almost laughed. I had built my identity around making soup, scheduling pills, reading the same book out loud. The therapist asked what I wanted. I had no clear answer. I had been clinging to a promise I thought my mother owed me. Realizing that felt like an internal collapse. It also felt like a strange kind of freedom. I made a new strategy that wasn't just legal. I started collecting small things the woman couldn't touch. My mother's recipes in my handwriting, voice memos from visits, a video of us laughing at a wedding. I reached out quietly to neighbors who had seen things. One neighbor gave me a calendar where the woman had written the dates she'd been at the house and circled the days my mother signed documents. Another neighbor admitted she'd felt pressured by the woman to not talk to family. These were not bombshells in court by themselves, but they were human details that painted a pattern. I also stopped trying to prove my worth to people who had already decided. I stopped replying to the woman's public posts. I stopped calling my brother. I focused on my sons for the nights their dad let them stay. I started going to a caregiver support group where I met a woman who had been through the same fight. She told me to keep a file of every text and every receipt. She handed me a form letter she used when contesting a will. She said something blunt and true. People will choose the easier story. In the courtroom, the woman's face was calm. She wore my mother's favorite brooch. Her lawyer framed the whole thing around autonomy. My mother was a grown woman who made choices until the end. My lawyer argued undue influence. The judge asked hard questions about timing, vulnerability, and intent. Halfway through, the woman's lawyer produced a notarized video of my mother saying she was happy and wanted her affairs simplified. It was edited, clip-stitched with soft music. I felt like I was watching a funeral for the truth I had lived. The holy shit moment came when the judge asked about the bank transfer. A small sum had been wired to an account in the woman's name 2 months before the will. That transfer had a memo, for care. My mother's signature on the transfer was shaky but present. The woman's story cracked. She had said the money was a reimbursement for expenses. The bank manager testified that the woman had been listed as a secondary signatory the same day the power of attorney changed. The courtroom went cold. We settled a few weeks later. The judge encouraged settlement because litigation would drain what remained. The settlement was messy. The home title remained in the woman's name for a short period while debts were paid. I received enough to move out of my mom's house and afford therapy and classes to return to work. The woman kept the brooch. It wasn't everything. It wasn't the full undoing I wanted. It was something. It was legal paper and receipts and a small envelope that let me breathe. After it ended, I stood in the empty kitchen and packed a box of my mother's chipped mugs. I thought about how I had been singing the same lullaby and how my voice had been the last thing she heard some nights. That private memory had no will attached to it. No court could take that away. I set boundaries I had never imagined. I unfriended the woman from social media and blocked her numbers. My brother came by months later with a card and a small apology that meant more to me than the money had. He said he had been overwhelmed and scared. I forgave him and told him it would take time. The end was not a movie victory. The house sold and the woman moved out when the settlement demanded it. She posted once about finding peace and thanked people for support. Most people moved on. Some continued to whisper that I had been greedy. I accepted that as a cost. I also started saying no. I went back to school part-time. I taught my sons how to make my mother's soup. I visited my mother's grave without the suffocating need to prove anything. I kept a small framed photo of us on my wall. Her handwriting that had felt like a verdict became just handwriting again, mouse-scratched lines on paper that belonged to a person who made choices and mistakes. The story closed with me walking away from a house that had been my life for 2 years. I locked the door and left the key in the lawyer's office. I felt lighter and terrified. That night, I sat with a friend who had driven 3 hours to help me move and refused to leave until I'd eaten. She held my hand and said the blunt thing every lawyer and therapist echoed, "You did what you could." I believed her in pieces. I didn't get everything back. I got something steadier, boundaries that kept me alive, a truth I could defend without collapsing every time someone called me selfish. My mother's will left everything to the woman who replaced me. The woman got some things, the court gave me some things, and I kept the rest in memory. At the end, the opposite of the opening was real. Quieter, clean lines, new rules. I stopped being the daughter defined only by what she sacrificed. I started being the woman who survived.